Leanne is starting now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bromford and Hodge Hill Ward Forum meeting. This is a joint meeting with the Ward End Ward, and tonight's meeting is a one agenda item, which will be discussing the public space protection order. We've postponed the meeting. We started slightly later at 6:30 because there was a funeral within the local community and people were arriving late. So in attendance, we've got Councillor Majid Mahmood from Bromford and Hodge Hill Ward, myself who'll be chairing the meeting, Councillor Diane Donaldson from the Bromford and Hodge Hill Ward, and also in attendance, Councillor Mohammed Iqlaq from Ward End Ward. We have Chris Hamilton from the West Midlands Police, who will be presenting and explaining about the public space protection order. We'll take his presentation and then we'll take questions and answers from residents afterwards. I'd just like to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and will be available on the City Council's website for future reference by their YouTube channel. Can I ask you all to keep your microphones muted for the duration of the meeting? And if you'd like to speak, can you raise your hand? So it's if you raise a hand symbol, it's at the top of the screen. You see the little icon with the raise a hand symbol. If you want to ask a question, just click on that symbol, and then I will take the questions in order as they appear in the chat. Okay, so we'll kick off with the presentation from Chris around the public space protection order. Good evening, Chris.
Thank you, Councillor, and good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I work for the Community Safety Team, which is part of Birmingham City Council, but also working with partners like West Midlands Police, West Midlands Fire. Excuse my throat. For some reason, I've got a sore throat. I don't know why. It's certainly not COVID related. And in the past, we've had a public space protection order on two locations primarily. One was in Washford Heath, that primarily covered Ward End Park and the adjoining roads. And we had another that covered the Fox and Goose area. And just a small explanation, if I may. The public space protection orders, although they are made by the local authority, we have to consult with the wider public and we have to consult with all our partners, of which there are many, as you can imagine, because you can't just have a order in a location that prohibits certain behaviour without meaningful consultation. So there's two limbs which they argue which are reasonable to apply for a PSPO, and I'll call it the public space protection order, but I'll call it PSPO for tonight's meeting. And the two arguments are that certain activities within a particular area have a detrimental effect on that area and the quality of life of those living in that area, and also that any of those activities that are carried out within a public place will have the same effect. So it's about both behaviours and the effect of those behaviours and the wider remit in the public, in environmental issues. Typically, if I just remind people, we had lots of individuals begging from the street community, begging wise, around Fox and Goose. And one of the terms of the public space protection order was to make it so that they couldn't beg. Now, whilst that order was in place, it didn't stop people from begging, but what it meant was that it gave the police the powers to encounter, address and redirect people away from that particular area. So the public space protection order, and they tend to last for around about three years. I'm just looking at Councillor Donaldson's messages here. I'm mindful that I don't want to keep talking about something if I'm losing people. So I'm happy to take questions at any time, Councillor, not necessarily at the end.
Okay, that's fine with me. If people just raise a hand, and then I'll bring them into the discussion.
So typically there's a process within the local authority where we have to go through a number of steps. Like most legal orders, we have to go through lots of different processes. What the public will see is the day of the order when it arrives. What they won't see is all the background consultations and reviews and steps that we've had to take. And yes, it's laborious, and yes, it's thorough, but it's also a legal requirement, both from the local authority and from the Home Office, that we actually, when we do put a public space protection order in place, that it's reasonable, it's timely, it's manageable, it's policeable. So you have to bring in lots of different thought processes. And what you start off with is a number of terms, a number of requests, a number of desires from people like the public or public groups or community groups or different partners. But ultimately, you've got to drive that particular wish list down, because you can't have everything in there. And also, there's lots of things you couldn't and wouldn't put in there, such as prostitution, because we all know that that particular area or that particular pastime is actually illegal anyway, or the soliciting is illegal. So you wouldn't put in things into a public space protection order that already have law that underpins it. For instance, and I don't use this word easily, if you were to carry out an assault on someone, ultimately that's a Section 5 public order offence and you could get arrested for it. So you wouldn't necessarily put that into the public space protection order. But if I quote you about the tailgating that happened in a tower block in Ladywood, where lots of people were loitering around in the lobby area of one particular tower block, and because that caused a real nuisance and harm, we managed to get that as part of the terms of the Ladywood public space protection order. Because whilst it wasn't an arrestable offence for them to be loitering in there, it was an arrestable offence once it became a PSPO. So what it does, certain behaviours that aren't that can't be legally challenged to the law can actually be legally challenged through a public space protection order. So I don't want to confuse matters, Councillor, too much.
Ask this question, please.
So I'm happy to receive any questions at all.
Yeah. Things that aren't illegal, for example, the use of the nitrous oxide canisters.
Yes.
Which are becoming very prolific, and I've seen changes as well, that it's not just the little nitrous oxide canisters that are being used. Now they're gigantic canisters, or enormous canisters that are being used. That it's not illegal to use them. So under a public space protection order, could we make it not illegal or stop the use?
It would, because as I described, what you're asking for within the terms of a PSPO are certain behaviours that may not have been arrestable through the legal process, through the criminal laws, but because they form part of the overall terms of the public space protection order, they do become an offence if breached. For instance, if part of the term was not to have nitrous oxide gas canisters in a certain part of the Bromford Hodge Hill ward. What we had first have to demonstrate is what collectively have the partners done to address it locally. Are we sure that we've exhausted all avenues in regards to normal policing and enforcement through possibly littering enforcement or littering legislation? Because as we say, buying the nitrous oxide isn't illegal, but obviously disposing of it is, and that may well come down to a littering offence. Now, if that has been tried and tested, but the problem continues, that's a very good argument to take to what we call the operations board of the community safety partnership, to say to them, this is what we've done, these are the methods we've tried, this is what the police have done, this is what the local partners have done, but it's still at epidemic proportion. It may well be that consideration is made to say the use of nitrous oxide canisters under the terms of the public space protection order is illegal, and anyone found in breach of that can be arrested. And once you breach a public space protection order, it becomes criminal. It's a criminal offence to breach a public space protection order. So I hope people listening can see that you don't just put things in there, because some of the resistance we've met on public space protection orders throughout the country, not just the local authority, and I'm thankful that Birmingham hasn't had too much resistance from various groups, human rights groups, is that you don't put something in there that is going to disadvantage communities or put certain people in the risk. For instance, with beggars, there's been quite open dialogue and lots of arguments up and down the country that by putting begging as a clause into a PSPO, you're actually concentrating on vulnerable people, and so you are ultimately criminalising them as well if you took the breach at its fullest. That isn't the case, let me remind people, but those are the kind of arguments up and down the country where people have been challenged. And the reason why we've brought in a new process was because of those challenges. We've looked up and down the country, we've realised what the challenges are all about, and we've been very careful under scrutiny of our legal services to make sure that when we do put a public space protection order together, it's accurate, it's manageable, it's reasonable, and it can be argued that it's necessary.
Would this apply to the nitrous oxide canisters, the use of? Could we?
Yes, it is a consideration to be sat down at a point in the future where we thrash out the terms of the PSPO, and it might well be that we sit round the table and at the local partnership delivery group and say, these are the 10 terms we've got. We need to go through those 10 terms and just make sure that they're not in any way detrimental to local communities. They don't disadvantage certain groups, and they are reasonable and proportionate in what they set out to do.
What can we do as councillors and residents to give evidence to yourselves?
We use evidence of all kinds. We have public forums like today with the council of surgery. We've got local ASB surveys that will go out shortly. We've got the Be Heard consultation platform for Birmingham City Council that will go out to everyone. That will give them a chance to send back their opinions, their accounts of what's going on. There'll be local road shows, which I think they've already had one or two within the Fox and Goose Centre, and ultimately we look at impact statements, and those impact statements tend to come from lots of businesses, because businesses tend to give you a real overview of, for instance, how those street community individuals affect their business, how it affects the customers, how it affects them personally, how they've had to change the way in which they open the shops and close the shops. So you can imagine the impact that they can provide you is quite wide, much wider than, say, somebody saying, yes, we always find nitrous oxide canisters on our road. If collectively 10 people said that, that would become a much greater argument. If, for instance, B&M in Fox and Goose, if there is a B&M in Fox and Goose, said every morning we open up, we have to sweep up 100 canisters or more. That suggests that there's a bit of an epidemic, a bit of a big proportion of of antisocial behaviour, not illegal, but antisocial behaviour.
And how do we make the impact statements? How do residents go about this?
As we go on, as this application is processed, and if people want to make any kind of statements, those statements aren't given out to individuals. So those people making statements, they're very safe. They're anonymous. They're not anonymous, but they don't go out to the public for the public to see what everyone has said. They're not personal. I don't believe they're personal. I've never seen one that is personal. But at the same time, there is in my world, we have our email address, our mailbox address is, and I'll put it on here for you as well, Diane, put it on the chat, because if people want to know more, obviously they can look at some existing PSPOs across the city on the Birmingham City Council website. And also, if people want to know more about the one that's ongoing at the Fox and Goose, I'm going to put my email address, our mailbox address on here. Is that okay?
Fine.
Doing that now, Councillor.
Thank you.
CSP inquiries at birmingham.gov.uk. Yep.
I know myself and Councillor Mahmood and some of the residents here in the litter picking groups, we've evidenced this ourselves, and we've put it on our Facebook pages, our Twitter account. So it's been widely evidenced on social media.
And that's a real positive, because we don't want to, when we do come to present this at the Birmingham Community Safety Partnership Ops Group and to Cabinet, what we don't want to do is say that we've only got representation from a small location within the Bromford Hodge Hill ward and part of the Ward End ward. We want to show that we've collectively looked at all four corners of those wards, and it won't be for the want of trying. If people don't come forward and don't obviously make comments, that's up to them entirely. But if we've got to argue for the order, if we've got to persuade those who sign off the order that it's necessary, you do that with evidence, and that evidence can come in all shapes and sizes, and as I say, it can come in the form of a statement from individuals who are not necessarily nitrous oxide, but who are disturbed with certain behaviours within their neighbourhood, that they can evidence, and they can evidence that they've tried to do this. So yes, by all means, CSB inquiries is where our mailbox sits. So if people have any comments, I have no problem with it coming through CSB inquiries. It will reach me, and I can collectively start putting all of these opinions together.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Iclat's got his hand raised. So, Councillor, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. Can you hear me? I've got a really bad connection.
We can hear you. I can hear you fine.
Okay, thanks. Chris, can I first of all thank you for attending tonight and briefing us on this. I know you've done a lot of work leading up to this. The one thing I'm concerned about is, Warden, as you said before, it was part of Washwood Heath PSPO, and some of it was Bromford and Hodge Hill. Have we got any figures, Chris? Because I'll tell you why I'm concerned. Because when I became the councillor, I started asking the police officers, and they wasn't even aware there was a PSPO especially around Washwood Heath Road. So have we got any figures in the 3 years that it's been in practice of any reprimands or fines or anything positive about the PSPOs?
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, I am aware. Strangely, I'm not quite sure what happened, that the police team weren't aware, or some of the police team weren't aware that there was a PSPO in place. Because alongside any PSPO, it's widely advertised, and they have signage, which is part and parcel of the overall process. Now, I do know, speaking with some of the Washwood Heath team recently and previously, that a lot of sterling work has gone on by the police to engage with local public and groups. And I believe what they done, besides serving any what they call suspected offence tickets under the PSPO, in fact, they didn't do that for a time. They were encountering certain people and moving them on or dealing with them at that time. I'm advised that's the way they done things, which explains to me why not many suspected offence tickets come my way. Let me just step back a bit. Suspected offence tickets are what we introduced as part of the PSPO process, so that when individuals are encountered and potentially breaching, they are served a ticket, and that ticket acts as a warning to them, and it gives them 14 days to turn their behaviours around or to offer any mitigating circumstances. If that same person continues to act up in that particular area, they will be issued with possibly a second ticket, which will carry a fixed penalty notice or could carry something stronger. So that 14-day cooling off period was something the local authority decided to introduce as part of its PSPO process in order to give people a chance, in order to provide some mitigating time for people to say, sorry, I wasn't there, or sorry, I was there, it won't happen again, rather than criminalise them by going straight down the criminal route for a breach.
Do we know how many tickets were issued?
Okay, Councillor, I will look into that for you and speak with the neighbourhood police team at some point this week and see if I can come back with some figures, because in my ignorance, it might well be, Councillor, that instead of serving any tickets under the PSPO, they may have been serving community protection notices or community protection warning letters or some other form of warning. So it may be that they may not have used the legislation to its fullness under the previous PSPO, but being absolutely honest and being fair, it might be that they used something else. But I'll look to get that information for you this week, Councillor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. I've got Councillor Mahmood who's got his hand raised. Would you like to come in, Majid?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, for the presentation. Quite comprehensive. I mean, originally the PSPO was introduced or butting onto Bromford Hodge Ward around Tesco car park because of the massive antisocial behavioural issues we had there, especially in the night time where people joyriding and all sorts of activities were happening there, keeping residents awake every night. Thankfully, thanks to Tesco and to the police who played a part as well, we've managed to stop that ASB with the introduction of barriers, and they've kind of put these kind of little speed bumps everywhere, so you can't really joyride cars there in the evening. And we've not had any complaints since Tesco installed those barriers. Just like to mention the fact that Tesco have helped us in eradicating the ASB there, but obviously keeping the PSP there, because if something happened to the barriers, then that would come back straight to us again, and that's not something that we would want. But in terms of extending, I have asked the question just to let residents know of extending the PSPO across other parts of the ward as well, where we've got major ASB problems. So a lot of the avenues on the corners, you get lots of ASB happening. There are people parking up on the night and throwing litter and all sorts. Hodge Common, that's, you know, there's habitual fly tippers on the Hodge Common, which we find it difficult to manage. On the Bromford estate itself, there's always been complaints around people parking up in cars and getting up to all sorts of antisocial behaviour as well. But it's not something that, you know, we can't. I mean, Chris can just explain to the residents why we can't just, you know, willy-nilly expand the PSPO as much as we would like. On the avenues themselves, we've had a number of burglaries, some quite horrific as well on Eastbourne Avenue. And the last ward forum meeting we had was centred around law and order. That's something we can look at. But again, it's going to be difficult trying to extend that. I know the MP, Liam Byrne, I've spoken to him and he is in favour. So once we have the introduction of this PSPO, then clearly we can have a look at what else we can do later on down the line. One of the issues that I picked up this morning is from some residents around Colborne Primary, where some of the PSPO, I think, will extend towards that part of it, around people just basically blocking their drives when they're going to pick up children or drop off children at the school. And the police have basically, because they haven't got the resources, they're just sticking to their guns and saying it's a civil matter, which it is. It's trespass. It's actually a civil matter. If someone blocks your drive, and police, all the police can do is speak to them and ask them not to, but you're supposed to take out a civil action. Who, you know, in all seriousness, who is actually going to take out a civil action because someone's blocked their drive for 5-10 minutes? But it's these type of, you know, it may seem like small things to the police, but these are major things to residents. If you're trying to get out your drive and someone's parked the car in front of the drive, you know, it's a major annoyance to residents. As is gas canisters, we're finding gas canisters everywhere across the ward. Whenever we go out door knocking or leafleting, we find gas canisters, and that's a major problem. I know with the PSPO, would just to let us know, would the PSPO give the general powers to the police to be able to stop people who are using these gas canisters, or they're standing around in a gang and partying, etc.? That would be really helpful if it did. But again, just thank you, Chris, for the work you've put into this. I know it's been quite lengthy and tiresome as well, but it will be worth it in the end. Thank you.
So thank you for those comments, Councillor, and very valid indeed. And all the things you mention are aspirations, and I absolutely get that. And I just refer back to what I mentioned earlier, is at some future point, and not too far away in the distance, we will draft up what our PSPO order will look like. That will include some add-ons, as I spoke to Councillor Donaldson before and other people. Again, I'm led by our legal services, because we tried to almost piggyback some of the old Washwood Heath PSPO onto the new Fox and Goose, but then I was advised that that's not within the spirit of the legislation. So if you start off with a proportionate and manageable geographical location, that is so much simpler to argue for than it would be to argue for an area that's 4 times the size, where the first and ultimate question will be, well, how are you going to find the resources to manage that? So you have to be ready and waiting for those questions, because those questions will come. Again, when I mentioned earlier certain behaviours, and you mentioned absolutely one there, Councillor, about the parking issues, we have to be in a position where, if we are putting that into any order, we have to evidence what attempts have been made to address that issue previously. And again, it's not a police issue, although police have in the past just advised people that they are blocking a drive and just do the courteous thing and move on. But they're not there to do that, let's be honest. And it might well be that we have to speak with Alan Porter from Highways, the engineer, to see what it is, if there is a kind of a particular spot, a particular location leading, for instance, to Colborne School. What is it that they are looking to do? Have they introduced something? For instance, have they introduced 20-mile-an-hour zones? Have they introduced exclusion zones, as they have done, have they piloted in Birmingham before, where people have to park a mile away and then walk to school? What is it that they've done? So we can actually then put that into our order to say to those people looking at this and reviewing it, and it will be reviewed ultimately by the the director of city operations, Rob James, and it will be the superintendent. And you imagine just presenting that on a plate to them. The first thing they will say is, yeah, I get why you want that in there, Chris, but what have we done to attempt to address that particular problem prior to it becoming a PSPO? Because you can't just overlook existing legislation, if indeed existing legislation is around. What you can't do is substitute the PSPO for that. You have to at least demonstrate that we've looked at it, we've applied some methodology to it, we've applied some enforcement to it. However, that's failed. And so the only other way we feel that it can actually have a marked improvement is through putting it down as one of the terms of the potential PSPO. And it's gone quiet, Councillor.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Right, I'm just asking if there are any comments from any of the residents in the meeting.
It does seem complicated, and it's not. The process itself is thorough, but it has to be, because what you want is something that's you want something that's not going to draw a legal challenge, because the last thing you want within the first 6 weeks is for certain groups, certain political groups or certain other groups that could come to you and say, why have you got this written into your PSPO? Now that takes you into a different environment, because that then is lodged at the High Court, and then obviously it starts costing an awful lot of money to defend. So what you want, the whole point of the consultations that happen before the implementation of the PSPO, is so we can get those arguments out the way.
And what type of groups would you envisage would have?
I think one of the groups that was opposed to the city centre was one of the human rights groups that had a real concern that imposing a begging term within the city centre would predominantly disadvantage the street community and make a beeline for what they deem to be vulnerable people, and was an easy way to get begging off the street by criminalising it or by criminalising the individuals. So I didn't see the full argument, but I do know that they asked some very pertinent questions, and it went to our legal services, and there was a standoff for several weeks where we had to give a legal response, not my response, not your response. It had to be from a legal background. And then that had to go through that particular group, I've no doubt, who had some form of legal support as well. And then on the basis of that, they challenged the answers to that. So what you try and do is make it so that you aren't targeting certain groups. For instance, I think if you was to say no sex workers in the Fox and Goose, sex workers themselves, that particular description, whilst it's not illegal, the soliciting of it is. But then if you had that in there, it could be that you have what they call, you have, oh gosh, what's it called? There's a group that operates in Ladywood who absolutely represent, and quite rightfully, they represent the welfare of these girls. And they would argue, I've no doubt they would argue that by putting that clause in there, it was endangering those girls because they were moving off locally common areas to them, and they're moving into areas of the unknown. So that typifies what some of the questions that come through are. Now, it might not make sense to us at the time because, let's be honest, most of us are absolutely polarised on making the area safe. But those types of groups exist. They're everywhere. They're national. And what you do, even
there
though
would be groups who would be protecting criminal activity, that would
the groups that are protecting what they see as vulnerable groups, and sex workers are what they deem to be vulnerable
I can understand
groups.
For sex workers, but people just
Yeah.
out there, street drinkers, that type of behaviour.
So, and what you've got is, whilst you try and contain this, because it's an order within Birmingham, it's an order within East Birmingham, it's an order within the Hodge Hill, Bromford and Ward End wards, what it does do by going out to that on Be Heard, part of Birmingham's platform of consultation, it goes out to anyone who's got an interest. And it might well be that, and you I'm sure you know, councillors, there are lots of groups out there ready and waiting to challenge the local authority, sometimes on a misdemeanor, sometimes on a whim, but knowing that they can derail something, knowing that they can actually provide an argument, and knowing that it's going to take some time to answer that, because you can't just say no, go away. You have to answer them in a timely and reasonable fashion, and that can take time. And those groups look for slip-ups. If I was to respond to those groups, I dare say I'd be saying it in my language, I'd be saying it in my tone, which is why it goes to our legal services, so they can give you the legal response. And then if they're going to challenge it, they can then challenge it through a legal framework rather than a personal one-to-one framework. Personal one-to-one framework before the actual implementation of the PSPO, that's great. It's not a problem at all, like we're doing tonight. But once that PSPO is implemented, what we don't want is these human rights groups stepping up to say, listen, this is all wrong. You've made these people criminals now because you've earmarked them as a nuisance in the area, which means that next time they get encountered, they're possibly going to be arrested. That's not the case, but I'm sure they will make a case of that.
What can we do for these young people that are out there and they're using this nitrous oxide, because it's extremely dangerous, and we have seen over the past few years deaths from taking nitrous oxide. Can we do something more to highlight the actual dangers that young people are putting themselves through?
Collectively.
Themselves to.
Yes, I mean collectively, councillors and our audience tonight, there's lots of things that happen in the background, and we do so much more. We have what we call a local partnership delivery group, where we look at how we get the message out to communities about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And if you typify things like street watch or speed watch, these are things that are born out of very much like nitrous oxide. It came along years and years ago. People got fed up of it. They formed themselves as a group, and they work with all the partners and agencies, predominantly the police, high-vis jackets, in order to reach out to that community or to those individuals who are potentially putting others at risk. Again, this is something that our public health colleagues can maybe get a grip of. I don't, and I'm sure the councillors know this, I don't do all the various services within the council. We have a mixture of services. So something like this, councillor, could very easily be an agenda item in our local partnership delivery group. And we do have Joe, we had Mo Phillips from Public Health last time who came in, and she may well be able to give us some steer on this. And it may well be that there's already something out there that is signposting the dangers of what taking nitrous oxide means. And it might be that there is some work that they can do as a public health section to that community, if there is one location. Ultimately as well, it's about when these people are encountered, if it's within the PSPO framework and that term, we don't just survey suspected offence ticket on them. We look to engage with them, we refer them onto youth services, we signpost them onto either alcohol or drug misuse agencies. So it's not just a case of handing them a suspected offence ticket and saying, if you offend again, we will take you to court, bloody this, bloody that. No, we don't. And for under 18s, we certainly don't. Sorry, under 16s, we certainly don't. We do what we call a referral. So that could be referred into places like Change, Grow and Live, or it could be through Aquarius if the young persons, or if the issue around street drinking became very prominent. We wouldn't look to take that person down the criminal route. We would look, as we always do, we would look at what alternatives is there, non-legal first. And ultimately, if the non-legal avenues don't work, at some point we would have to consider some form of legal action, whether that be through criminal proceedings or whether that be through civil proceedings, which is what we work to in the partnership.
That's reassuring, because I'm concerned about what started off as small canisters and has now escalated to enormous canisters. So that's pretty scary, really, to think that young people are using these really large canisters, and the effect that it can have on their health is causing brain damage, heart damage, and even death. So it's reassuring to know that there are organisations out there that are helping these young people.
There are, and it's a very timely subject, councillor, which we can agenda for our next local partnership delivery group.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I've got Councillor Iklak who's raised his hand. I don't know if that's an historic hand or a new hand. Councillor Iklak.
Thanks, Diane. It's a new hand. Just
okay.
Just, Chris, I know you've been very thorough and you've done a lot of groundwork. It'll be brilliant to have, in an ideal world, a condensed PSPO order. But unfortunately, our wards and the incidents that go on within our wards, Bromford and Hodge and Ward End, they're in bits and drabs, different areas. One of my major issues in Ward End is Washwood Heath Road by Paddy Power, antisocial behaviour. The number of complaints I get every single week, people are scared to actually walk through. So the amount of people that actually gather around that area, and the other one's Micklehove Road. So it'll be interesting to see how we phase in the PSPO, the area that it will cover, and we really do need to tackle it in that way.
Yep, I totally agree. I mean, as I know, that is an area, that is a location with demand. I talked to the local police teams again, and without repeating myself, councillor, I hope I'm not doing that. It would be about what measures have they taken out. For instance, let's talk about Paddy Power. What measures have they taken with Paddy Power to try to deter those individuals loitering around or hanging around. Now, yes, the police and the PCSOs will do their patrols, and yes, I'm sure they will encounter some, and yes, I'm absolutely positive they may well signpost those individuals on who have either drug or alcohol dependencies onto the rightful agencies. But then there's an onus, there's a responsibility on Paddy Power as an organisation themselves. What is it that they're doing? And then what you do from that angle is you look at what they're doing, and you'd like to think that they're going to cooperate. You look at what their shop is doing, how it's set up, how does it attract customers, what is it they can do better, and it might well be that Paddy Power themselves end up, in this case, being issued, I've heard this on the grapevine, being issued with a community protection warning letter, and then ultimately, if they don't change their ways, a community protection notice, which could result in a hefty fine if they don't improve their operations. Now that, if that was tried and tested, and again, I've heard that from the local police team, if that was tried and tested and that could be evidenced, but still we've got lots of loitering and lots of threatening behaviour and lots of antisocial behaviour in that location. And if we agreed that we could include it, again, I'm going back to that, keeping it in a refined area rather than like that, because you run the risk that if you create something so big, the question will come back is, that's far too big to manage. Why was it that initially we looked at 2 and now you want 1 giant one? And I've had that come back to me from our legal services. So it's, again, and I mentioned this earlier, it's within keeping of the spirit of the legislation. What you can't do is make it so disproportionate that you've covered, I don't know, for instance, if you went down as far as Needles Park Road in Heartlands, you'd have to demonstrate that the Heartlands or certain parts of the Heartlands was of that same demand as, say, Washwood Heath, in which case was the same demand as the Fox and Goose. So, yes, wouldn't it be wonderful? And I think, Councillor, you'll know this, Councillor Donaldson, you might know this. Back in the day when we had lots of alcohol, alcohol orders, not drink banning orders or drink banning orders. I think there was possibly 50 or 60. And I always turn around and said, why don't we just have one global Birmingham one? And I don't think it was possible. I don't think they could ever do it. So, yes, I get what you're saying, Councillor, about Paddy Power. And again, like Councillor Donaldson, I think it's quite a good location to bring up as part of our LPDG agenda at our next meeting. As you know, when we have a location meeting, we're looking at specific locations where there's demand. And I think what Councillor Donaldson has said, equally so, justifies what you said, Councillor, about Paddy Power as well.
Thank you, Chris. Could you just give us an overview of the area that the public space protection order will be covering? Some of the residents here won't be aware of the actual area that it's covering.
If I can be super clever, I'll try and get a map of it for you. In the meantime, if I could just describe for you, it will cover the, if I'm right in thinking, Beaufort Road or Bromford Lane area round by the Fox and Goose, and it will take in Washwood Heath Road where the small retail shops are, and it will carry on down, and help me out here please, councillors, it will carry on down to, gosh, in fact, let me get the map up and see what I've got here.
Are you taking the recreation ground in St Margaret's Road, that area.
Right. Let me see if I've got something here for you, councillors. If you just want to just, right, I've got it. I've got something. So if I just kind of turn that map around, excuse me, everyone. I'm sorry to be ignorant like this. Right. Okay. So I'll come back to you. I'm going to try something smart now, councillor. Now,
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
as you can see, if people can see where I'm highlighting the cursor, this was the black lined area was the Fox and Goose PSPO, the former PSPO, and the area mapped out in yellow dotted lines. For all intents and purposes, I believe that was the Washwood Heath PSPO. That was. Now, to bring the two of them together would be a monumental task in its size, in its geography. And I think I'd be minded to say, if there is to be a further consideration into this other area here, I personally believe that would have to be a separate public space protection order. However, if you look at where the cursor is, I think there's already an argument that we could maybe include a couple of roads around here where there's been quite substantial antisocial behaviour. And again, and it could be that we continue that line there and we come over to we could come to about there. So we could move the black marker up to there. Now, what you always want to do with a PSPO is you want to be nice and tidy. So you don't want to go up the left-hand side of the road. If in fact, they're going to start playing up on the right-hand side of the road. So you always go to the furthest point and you would try to do that. So you'd go to the end of a road and then you'd go back up there to there. You'd come back down there. So you'd make it all like that. But that's overcomplicating things at the moment. That in the black line is where the old Fox and Goose PSPO was. And that, I believe, this area within here was the old Washwood Heath PSPO.
So the new one will incorporate what is in the black line and extend over.
Yeah, I think there was one or two roads. I think, on memory, can you see what I'm doing here, councillor?
Yeah, it was Mickleham Road,
the
one we wanted to include.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's about here, isn't it, councillor? I think that was about down here somewhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's down there somewhere.
Down here somewhere. So you see, for me, that would be a reasonable expansion of the area if you'd done that, almost. Whereas if you done that, I think you would definitely be open to some form of challenge from our legal services to say that's just too great an area to try and do a PSPO for.
Okay, so just looking on the black boundary, so that takes in Brockhurst Road, then it goes down Sandhurst Avenue, Ventnor Avenue, back onto Coleshill Road.
I'll try and move it over for you a bit.
Yeah, down Beaufort Avenue, along Stetchford Road, then down up onto Burney Lane, and then up Allen Rock Road, and then it will be taking in Foley Road and Mickleover Road, and then coming back onto Bromford Lane.
Yeah, and
test
maybe,
scales, more or less.
yeah.
Right.
And again, this is obviously something that will be subject to a number of conversations going forward, Councillor,
Okay.
through the LPDG, of course, and ultimately it will be open for partners to comment as well as yourselves.
Right, I've got let me just see somebody's. I've got a hand up here from Patricia Garcia. Would you like to come in, Patricia?
Hi, thank you very much. I just want to have some clarification on the order from the old order for Washwood East, the one that is in yellow in your map. Is this order now closed? I mean, is finished? Is there still the order, or do you need to reapply for another one?
We are reapplying for another one. It closed.
So okay, so you're doing at the moment there is two order in progress, the one from Bromford Hodge and the other one from Washwood East Ward End.
No, we're just concentrating on one PSPO.
Okay, so what about the other one, the other PSPO, the one that is that include Ward End and
There hasn't been any, if I can use the word appetite, there hasn't been certainly any appetite or evidence to support on the same scale as the one at Hodge Hill. And without that evidence, without that support, without that appetite, you can't just apply for a public space protection order.
But there used to be one, is that correct?
There used to be one, but because there used to be one doesn't mean that it continues. Every time you do a PSPO, they get reviewed, and ultimately you review them every 3 months, every 6 months, and they follow a term of on average about 3 years. And before a PSPO tends to come to the end, there will be a further consultation around the table to ask partners, to ask the police primarily, is there any justification in extending the timeline of a PSPO for a further 3 years? And if so, what can you offer up as evidence? Unfortunately, that information didn't come forward.
Okay, so after what Councillor Acklad was talking about regarding the PSPO from O'Gill, and that Warden has a bit of a different issue that might, or we could consider to have a PSPO, will it be better? How can I put that? Will it be an option to require or to require a PSPO only for Ward End if you cannot cover Ward End with the one that you are actually doing?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that conversation will have to take place in what I've referenced as the local partnership delivery groups, which is where a number of partners get together along with your councillors and possibly community representatives. And if there's a geographical area where we believe there are a number of concerns around certain types of behaviour, it would be a consideration to move forward, very much like we're doing with the Hodge Hill PSPO.
Okay, so that could be a consideration then.
It could be going forward. From a very selfish point of view, I just felt that trying to manage two running alongside each other would be, I think I'd set myself up to fail. And I think the partners themselves wouldn't thank me because it's quite a demanding undertaking. But you're quite correct. It could be one for the future where we consider it, talk about it and discuss it at the local partnership delivery group meetings.
I've got another question. You mentioned that local partnership meetings are those meetings open to the community, or is it only the representative, like the councillors?
The local partnership league groups tend to be open just to the councillors and professionals, and to any professional groups.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We don't seem to have any more questions from members or from residents. I think you've covered everything quite comprehensively, and yeah, it's been quite informative.
It's not my usual voice, councillor. I'm usually a little bit less croaky, but for some reason I've got this. I was at my son's football match yesterday, and I was shouting a bit louder than
too
most.
much.
But as the coach, not as the parents.
Okay. So as residents, then we know what we need to, as residents and councillors, we need to sort of highlight the issues and make sure that the evidence is delivered.
Yes.
To the consultation, whether it be by Be Heard or by the impact. Sorry, what are they called? Impact
statements.
Impact statements. Okay.
Collectively, there's a whole raft of ingredients. That's a great word. There's a whole raft of ingredients that go into making this particular casserole, and we'll call that the PSPO. So it's not just about statements. It's about testaments from shops. It's about describing from a police point of view operations that they've carried out in order to address certain behaviours, for them to document that. It's about me producing documents that I then take to several different higher community operation groups to ultimately get it signed off. A couple of the questions will always be asked, whether that be a cabinet member, councillor, senior police or senior official in the council, is why are we driving this forward? What is it that we've not tried before that we could try to avoid going down the PSPO route? But I think because we're at this stage, I think we can more than demonstrate that.
I just noticed in the chat there's a comment from Jill, and she's saying, I think this is referring to the nitrous oxide canisters. It's frightening that it's drivers that are doing this in isolated places. But so I think if people can come forward and let us know where this is happening, locations, that would be really helpful. But
I've just
does this? I'm not an expert in nitrous oxide canisters and what the effect it has, but does it affect one's driving? I
would honestly say yes, it does. Whilst it may not be I'm no expert, it may not be an hallucinogenic drug, but I'm absolutely certain taking enough of it would impair your ability to drive.
Okay, Chris, Bev's put something in the chat. You've just answered it, for what she can send out to residents on a mailing list.
Okay, so if people have access to the internet, I've just by coincidence done one myself where this particular one came up, and strangely enough, within it, when people go into it in their own time, it actually does have a term around nitrous oxide canisters. It says Oldby and Wigston, wherever that is, introducing a public space protection order for the use of psychoactive substances. Well, in fact, that's just kind of contradicted me. I didn't think it was, but it obviously is, such as nitrous oxide linked to antisocial behaviour. So this particular authority have gone down that route, which is marvellous, in fairness. It's something for me to look at.
Excellent. So we'll have a look at that ourselves and, you know, take
something from
what we're
that.
doing in.
Yeah,
I think that's near, or is it Leicester way, somewhere that way?
is it?
Yeah, Oadby, Wigston. I think it's near to Leicester.
That's quite a undertaking, because it comes across as quite a small place, is it?
It is a small place. I've been there, and it is a small place. So quite surprised that they have a big issue with
Yes, exactly, and they've even got
Mm.
the finances to support it. You know, because it's costly. Not that comes into consideration at this point, because ultimately it has to be managed going forward.
Right. Well, thank you, Chris. I don't think there's any more questions. Okay, I see a hand up here. Let me just, before I go, but I think that's Patricia's historic hand. So,
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. That's been really informative, and we'll do as much as we can as residents and elected members to get you the information and support that you need to push this forward.
Well, thank you, and thank you for all the questions. Some of it has come across as a bit rough because of the voice, and I do apologise. But CSB inquiries, look at the Birmingham Council website, and just on the search engine, just go for public space protection orders, or just scour the internet on the public space protection orders, and it will give you an insight into what they are, where they are, how many there are, and the kind of imaginative terms, I can call them. In the early days, I think they used their imagination, and I think that is one of the reasons why we've gone through an absolute thorough health check on our processes. But I'm glad to report our process is very, very professional and very worthy. So thank you all.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you once again.
Very informative.
We'll do our homework and see what Oadby and what they're doing over in their neck of the woods. See if we can get any tips from them. All right. Thank you, Chris, and we'll let you continue the rest of your evening. Thank you.
You too. Everyone enjoy themselves. Thank you. Have a safe evening.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Right, thank you, everyone. Before we wind up the meeting, I'd just like to see if there's any other business that people would like to highlight. No, I think, okay then, well, we'll come to the end of the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending and all your input. And we'll see if we can drive this joint, the PCSO, forward. Thank you. Bye-bye.